Good to go? All right. Good morning, everybody. Wow, it's interesting being up here. All right. Good morning. I hope you guys all had a good last week. I know we really enjoyed the warm weather at my house, and then now it's so cold again. It's like shock to the system. So hopefully, yeah, it was a tease. It was nice to get out, ride some bikes, and have them run and play, but it is cold now. So hopefully, I think it's supposed to warm up, at least warmer. But anywho, I'm glad you're all here, braved the cold. Let's just start real quick with a word of prayer, because that's the only way that this ever happens. So, all right. Dear Heavenly Father, I thank you for this morning. I thank you for the ladies that are here and the ladies that are online. I thank you for your word, and I thank you that you've given it to us that we can learn about you, Lord, and learn from you. And thank you for your Spirit who speaks in us and through us, Lord. Thank you for this lesson you've given me to share with these ladies today, and I pray that you speak through me today. Help the words that I say to be from you and you alone, and anything that is not of you, Lord, help me just to forget it and to leave it behind. Bless this morning. Use this time to strengthen us and encourage us. And just speak through me today, I pray. In Jesus' name, amen. So when I first started studying these passages, I had a hard time figuring out exactly what to talk about or even what to pull out of these passages. Chapter 37 is such a familiar passage and seemingly rather straightforward that I was unsure what direction to take. And then I also have chapter 38, which seemed so terribly random and out of place and scandalous. But the more I studied the passages, the more God has opened my eyes to what he was doing and working in all of these passages. And so I pray that today you would be encouraged and challenged from these as much as I have been in the last few weeks. I'm thankful every time I get to studying my passages, I always pray beforehand, Lord, reveal yourself, Lord, guide me, Lord, direct me. And every time he comes through, because without him, I would be up here just looking at you for an hour. So thankfully, as always, the Lord has come through. So hopefully it'll come out well. One of the hard things I've been wrestling with as I've studied these chapters was seemingly confusing and conflicting doctrines of God's sovereignty and God's omniscience and our free will. I have come to the conclusion that because God is omniscient and knows everything, and he's so beyond our primitive understanding, we will never be able to fully understand how God's sovereignty completely meshes with our free will. What we can do is continue to study it and learn more about who God is, and then trust that he knows how it works, and be thankful that he is sovereign and I am not. So, these passages, I feel like, are especially hard to understand in that sense and decipher how much God is using the circumstances that are happening and how much God is orchestrating circumstances that are happening in our lives, but also in this passage in the lives of those involved. And so I read many different commentaries with many different opinions as to how much God was orchestrating and how much God was just using what was happening. But what we do know is that sometimes God directly gets involved in our lives in order to bring about his plan for our growth and salvation. Such as when, future in our story, when God gives the cupbearer and baker dreams in prison, or when he gives Pharaoh dreams, and when he provides Joseph the ability to interpret the dreams. That is very clear that God was directly moving and working to put Joseph in a place of power to save Israel and from the famine and remove them from the Canaanites. But then there are times that God uses circumstances that are already in our lives to grow us and fulfill his plan for us, such as Joseph's slavery and his time in prison. I have come to the conclusion that it's not so important for us to determine which of these ways God is working. It's more important to note that God is working and recognize that he works in different ways at different times for his glory and for our good. So, as we read this passage, we can clearly see that God was present, and he was at work in the life of Joseph and his family to protect them and preserve their people to fulfill his promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We know that God told Abraham back in Genesis 15:13-16, that his people would be sojourners in another land that was not their own and be enslaved for 400 years before God would bring them out and back to the promised land. And we know that it is through the life of Joseph and his brothers that this prophecy takes place. God uses Joseph to not only save his family from the famine, but also from themselves. They were becoming so interconnected with the Canaanites and becoming more and more like them that they needed to be pulled out and separated. God brought them to Goshen to save them from the famine, but also so that they could be in their own land, away from others, in order to draw them back to himself. So far in this book, we have studied the fall of man, the life of Abraham, Isaac, and most recently, Jacob. The last few weeks, we've seen Jacob's less than stellar character and life choices, and we will see this continue in today's chapter, as well as we see the after effects of those choices on his children and their character. But today we're transitioning from focusing mainly on Jacob's life to the last section of the book of Genesis, which focuses mainly on Joseph's life. This is one of the longer sections of the book and covers the most details of any of the other patriarchs. Why such a focus on Joseph's life? Well, there are several reasons. First, there are a lot of important details in the story to cover. So many important ways that God was working and moving in Joseph's life. Secondly, his story and life were very instrumental in the saving of Israel and provide a fuller understanding of the transformation of Judah and his redemption to become the chosen one through whom the seed would come. And lastly, if you look closely, Joseph's life very much mirrors the life of Jesus on earth. I don't have time to dive into that aspect today, and I would hate to steal other people's thunders in the chapters to come. But if you have the time, I would encourage you to look into this. It's very interesting to see the many ways in which Joseph's life mirrors Christ's life on earth, and the way that God used this as another indication of what was to come with their rescuer. So last week, we left off. Jacob was now in Hebron with his father. Esau had taken his family and moved on to a land some distance away, since he and Jacob each had too much wealth to live so closely together, and Esau seemed to finally recognize that Jacob was the heir to their father's land. And so our chapter today starts out reminding us where Jacob is now. It says in verse 1, Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. This is the account of Jacob. The phrase, this is the account of Jacob, or some translations say, these are the generations of Jacob, indicates the next to last Toledot in Genesis. The word account here introduces the last section of Genesis. Each section starts with the account of so-and-so. So this is telling us this is the last section. Although it sets the groundwork that this is the generations of Jacob, it focuses mainly on the life of Joseph, just as the generations of Isaac focused mainly on the life of Jacob. You would think it would be through Joseph's line that the Messiah comes, since he's the main focus of these passages, and he seems to be the best, most righteous choice. And up until now, Genesis has focused mainly on the sons through whom the seed will come. However, as we'll find out later in Genesis, Joseph is not the one through whom the seed will come, but Judah is. So why the focus on Joseph? I would make the claim that this section is not so much about Joseph the person, as much as it is about God using Joseph and his circumstances in his life to preserve the life of Judah, through whom the Savior, the promised seed, will come. It's really all about God working and moving to rescue Israel, and more specifically Judah. He just so happens to use Joseph to do it. The fact that this is really about the redemption and rescue of Judah explains a little bit why chapter 38 is not as random as it may seem. But we'll get to that later. So, as we continue reading, we get our first glimpse into the character of Joseph and his family. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and he brought their father a bad report about them. So it begins with Joseph, just 17 years old, out in the fields, caring for his father's flock with the sons of his father's secondary wives, Bilhah and Zilpah. And he brings back to his father a bad report about what they are doing. Some commentaries I read tried to say that Joseph was so righteous he could not help but have to tell on the evil things they were doing. I, on the other hand, believe they want to believe he was holy. We like to think Joseph was almost perfect, but he was human like all of us. Thank goodness. So, in reality, his teenage self was a bit spoiled and puffed up. Now, to his credit, there's an element this was rather inevitable with the way he was treated, but needless to say, he was rather spoiled and self-centered. Part of why I say this is because the word here, report, is used in the rest of Scripture. Whenever it is used, it's in the negative sense of an untrue report. And here it qualified by the adjective evil, or my version says bad report. So in this instance, Joseph misrepresented his brothers. As we learn later, these men were not stellar characters, so what he said probably had some truth to it, and he simply exaggerated or added some inaccuracies to make them look even worse. We don't really know what the report was or what was going on, but we do know his report was not entirely truthful and therefore upset and angered his other brothers against him. And I'm sure they then told their brothers who were not there all about it, and they're all then even more angered. So let's keep reading. It says, "Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made a richly ornamented robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him." Now we see it did not help matters with his brothers that his father Israel loved him more than the others. And it's not like all siblings say, "Oh, mom and dad love so-and-so more than me." No, he truly did love Joseph more than his other brothers and made it very, very clear to anyone who had eyes to see. So I want to take a moment and get a glimpse into their family dynamics and a little bit into why they were the way they were. So let's remember back a few chapters. Jacob comes to Laban to escape Esau and find a wife. He falls madly in love with Rachel and is willing to do anything for her to be his wife. He sweats and toils more than he has ever done or had to do in his life to get her as his wife. He's so excited. They marry, and finally she is his. But wait, he has been tricked. And her much less attractive sister, Leah, that he does not care for, is now his. But the deed is done. However, he's still determined to have Rachel and does what he needs to for her to be his wife as well. His love, or lust, for Rachel has now led him to make a crucial mistake. He chooses not to obey God's instructions for his people and marries more than one woman. So, now he has two warring sisters whom he does not know what to do with. God sees Leah's pain and blesses her with children, while Rachel remains barren, creating more conflict and rivalry between the sisters, which Jacob's next crucial mistake is that he seems to take a hands-off approach and leave them to work it out on their own. Rachel, being barren and desperately wanting to have children of her own to keep up with her sister, who is having children, and to remain Jacob's favored wife, decides she needs to find a way to catch up with her sister with children and gives her slave, Bilhah, to Jacob to have children for her. This works, and Bilhah conceives and has 2 sons. So now Leah has 4, Bilhah has 2, but go figure, it doesn't fix Rachel's problems. It doesn't fill her void. Now Leah has stopped having children and sees that Rachel's slave is having children for Rachel. So she gives her slave Zilpah to Jacob to have more children on her behalf. And she has 2 sons. And then Leah ends up having 2 more sons. So now Jacob has 4 wives, 3 of whom he does not love, and 10 sons with all these wives, all vying for his affection and attention, when the woman he truly loves remains barren and unhappy, begging him to fix it. Finally, she conceives and gives birth to Joseph. Now Rachel is happy for a moment, and finally he has a son with her, his most favored wife. It is no wonder, with how blatantly he favors Rachel, that he favors their son Joseph. But then Rachel dies, giving birth to their second son, Benjamin. Now Joseph and Benjamin are all that is left in memory of his favored wife, Rachel, securing their spots as his most favored ones, and Joseph being most favored of all as the older of the two. As we continue reading through the story, we see that Jacob continues to make the same mistake he did with his wife and maintains a rather hands-off approach with his other sons and daughters, resulting in their rash, sinful choices, creating a greater divide between them and Jacob, and a greater connection to his favored, well-behaved son, Joseph. As I was reflecting on this so wonderful family history, I found 4 fatal flaws of Jacob's that have led to this volatile family relationship. You might have picked up on them as I was going. First, his clear and blatant favoritism of Rachel. It was so evident, these sons could not help but notice as well. If you remember, Reuben went and picked mandrakes to try to help his mom Leah gain favor with Jacob. This unwillingness to love Leah in the same way he loved Rachel created drifts and animosity within the family from the very beginning. Second, Jacob's hands-off approach to his wife's rivalry led to him having more wives and more dysfunction rather than finding a way for them to have peace and unity amongst the family. Third, we see he carried the same hands-off approach in raising his sons and daughters, failing to teach them the promises and instructions of God, leading to their destructive and sinful character and life choices. And lastly, we see that his blatant favoritism of Joseph is the final straw to destroy the family dynamics. You would think that Jacob would know better after watching how his parents' favoritism tore their family apart. But alas, the sins of the father have continued down through the generations yet again. So here we are. Joseph is 17, and his father gives him a richly ornamented robe. This is not just an expensive, beautiful gift, but a representation of Joseph as the one to receive a double portion of the inheritance. Jacob may have felt justified in giving the rights of the firstborn to Joseph because he was the firstborn born to Rachel, who was supposed to be his first wife before he was cheated and deceived. And Reuben, the true firstborn, had forfeited his rights when he slept with Bilhah a few chapters back. We don't really know why he felt this was a good idea, besides that Joseph was his favored son. But the robe was grand, it was expensive, and it set him apart even further from his brothers. This was not a coat a shepherd would wear. This was the coat of someone of importance and someone who is in charge. This fanned the flame of his brothers' hatred even more. It says, his brothers hated him so much they could not speak a kind word to him. It literally can be translated, they could not abide his friendly speech. So if you imagine, every time Joseph tries to be friendly and tries to be nice, they just blow him off and loathe his very presence. So between Joseph's distortions of the truth and Jacob's blatant favoritism, the brothers hated Joseph. Now, instead of blaming their father for his misguided affections, they put all the blame and hatred on Joseph. R.C. Sproul explains it so well. He said, Jacob perpetuated the sibling rivalry with his favor, and Joseph encouraged it with his attitude. If anyone has anything to say, you can interrupt me too, just so you know. So now, when you think it could not get any worse, Joseph has some dreams. So let's read about his first dream. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." His brothers said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. So I don't know what they were thinking with these questions, but part of me when I first heard that was wondering if they were kind of saying, are you actually taking Dad's coat to heart? You know, Dad put you in front and you actually think you're going to be in charge of us? You actually think you're going to rule over us? That's my interpretation, but I don't know. That was kind of what I thought of as I read that. If they're like, you really think that's going to happen? Aren't you funny? You little, because he's so much younger than the rest of them. I can imagine it would be extremely bitter to take. So, but however they meant it, they were not happy and they hated him. In his first dream, Joseph sees that his brother's sheaves of grain bow down to his. And Joseph decides it's a great idea to share this with his brothers, who already hate him. As I was reading up on this passage, I saw some commentators state that Joseph was in the right to share these dreams and that God gave him these dreams to fan the flame of hatred to help push his brothers over the edge. But others simply stated that God gave these dreams to Joseph, giving him a glimpse into his future. I tend to think that God gave these dreams to Joseph to be an encouragement to him, to tell him about what was to come, to give him a glimpse. But I don't think he necessarily had to share it with everyone. Because, Jacob had dreams and he didn't tell everyone. And so I don't think that's necessarily like you get a dream, you have to prophesy it. So that's my take. You can take it. Yes? The hard thing about it is we don't know how he said it. That's true. That's very true. Deb made the point, we don't know how he said it. We don't know his intonations. We don't know if he said I or if he was very humble about it. We don't know. But I think either way he said it, even if he said it very nicely, they would not have taken it well with how much they hated him. And so, but it's true. He definitely may not have been as puffed up as we always think. Yeah. She says, or he could have fanned the flame even worse. He was 17. He was proud that Dad had put him in. Dad was saying, oh, you're amazing. You're so amazing. You're so amazing. It's not hard to imagine he'd be like, even just not thinking and be excited of, look what I just had this dream. Isn't that crazy? My girls do that all the time. So, who knows? Yeah. But we do know for sure that God gave him these dreams. They came from God, and that, but we don't know why specifically God gave them to him in that moment. But just as he did, we can see Joseph made 3 critical errors in judgment when he shared them with his brothers, fanning their hatred even more. When he shared it, he lacked discernment. He did not recognize the tumultuous situation with his family and his brother's current animosity. Second, he lacked sensitivity. He did not consider how this dream would impact his other family members or the hurt it could bring. And lastly, he lacked maturity to know this was not the right time, or at least not the right way, to share God's vision for him with his brothers. So, my thought was he could have shared, if he wanted, he could have shared it with his dad or privately or things, but it seems like he had it and woke up and was like, guess what? And just threw it out there for all the world to see. So, how does his brothers respond? Well, just as you would imagine, hating him even more and questioning what he is saying. So, if that's not enough, Joseph then gets to have a second dream. So, it says, then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. Listen, he said, I had another dream. And this time the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me. When he told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, what is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you? His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. Now Joseph has another dream, this time blurting it out to his brothers and his dad. Clearly not learning from his brothers' reactions the first time. This time in the dream, his mom and dad and brothers are all bowing down to him. We learn later in Genesis 41:32, when Joseph is interpreting Pharaoh's dream, that when a dream comes in pairs, it solidifies that it will happen, that God will make that it will come true. So that is of deep significance to Joseph having a repeated dream, saying this is going to happen. Now, I do not know if Joseph knew that at this point. I would think probably not, but who knows? But we do know that later when he's in Egypt and he's sharing Pharaoh's dreams, that is, he does know it then and he shares it with Pharaoh then. And now, for once, his dad rebukes him. His dad is speaking up, and his brothers are too angry to even respond. They don't even know what to say. But we see that Jacob does ponder this in his heart. Jacob, of all people, should know the importance of dreams from God, for God has directly spoken to him numerous times through dreams. So hearing this dream from Joseph should have triggered something in him to know that this had some sort of significance and it was something worth remembering. So let's keep reading. Now, his brothers had gone to graze their father's flocks near Shechem, and Israel said to Joseph, "As you know, your brothers are grazing the flocks near Shechem. Come, I am going to send you to them." "Very well," he replied. So he said to him, "Go and see if all is well with your brothers and with the flocks, and bring word back to me." Then he sent him off from the valley of Hebron. When Joseph arrived at Shechem, When Joseph arrived at Shechem, a man found him wandering around in the fields and asked him, "What are you looking for?" He replied, "I'm looking for my brothers. Can you tell me where they are grazing their flocks?" "They have moved on from here," the man answered. "I heard them say, 'Let's go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan. Now we see that Joseph's brothers are away taking care of the sheep, and they are near Shechem. So Jacob decides to send Joseph to check on them. Now, if you remember, Shechem is not a great place for Jacob's family. They have quite a history of violence there. If you remember, that's the place his family butchered the whole city as revenge for their sister. So it makes sense for Jacob to be concerned for his sons and want to check on them to make sure they're okay and making wise choices. But you would think that Joseph would have better sense than to send his most favored son all the way to a dangerous area alone to check on his brothers who already hate him with every fiber of their being. Why he did not send one of his servants, I don't know. He sends Joseph. It's helpful to note Shechem is 50 miles north of Hebron, and it's about a 5 days journey. So Joseph gets there and is wandering around looking for his brothers. I cannot help but believe that God was protecting Joseph in this point. He's quite vulnerable, dressed in his fineries and completely alone, wandering in dangerous territory, looking for his brothers. God protects him from danger here and helps send a man to direct him to his brothers in Dothan, which is 14 miles farther north and another day's journey. Now he will be 64 miles away from his father and his father's protection. So, how do his brothers respond to the chosen one showing up to check on them yet again? It says in verse 18, "But they saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him." Let's just stop there for a minute. His brothers see him from afar, and before he gets them, they plot to kill him. Now, the area is flat and wide open, I would assume, and so they can probably see pretty far. And he was probably not moving terribly fast since he had traveled all this way so far. However, the eye can only see so far, and then so far to be able to recognize who is coming. His coat may have been a little bit flashy, so maybe that helped, but still, you can only see so far. And it did not take them long to decide to kill him. If this does not give you any indication of how deep their hatred was, I don't know what does. They've probably been dreaming up ways to kill him for years, and so now when they see their chance, it does not take them very long to jump to that decision and jump to that conclusion. So let's see what happens. Verse 19. Here comes that dreamer, they said to each other. Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns, and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams. When Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. Let's not take his life, he said. Don't shed any blood. Throw him into the cistern here in the desert, but don't lay a hand on him. Reuben said this to rescue him from them and take him back to his father. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the richly ornamented robe he was wearing, and they took him and threw him into the cistern. Now the cistern was empty. There was no water in it. So Reuben overhears their plans and jumps in to save Joseph. Does Reuben love his brother so much he can't bear to see his life taken? I don't think so. But this is another clear moment where God is working to preserve Joseph for the plans he has for his life. And Reuben here is not just suggesting not to kill them. He is giving a command. When he says, don't shed any blood, it was a command, meaning you shed no blood. He's distancing himself here from the plan by referring to them as you, not as us, but as you, and ordering them not to kill him. Instead, he suggests they throw him into the pit. This allows them time to cool off, and it would give him time to come back later to save Joseph and save his father some grief. He may also have been hoping to gain favor with his father, or at least not lose any more favor. Since he was the oldest, he most likely would have carried the blame for the incident, and he could not afford to lose any more favor since he was already in the doghouse for his affair with Bilhah. So the brothers listen and agree, and when Joseph arrives at camp, his 9 brothers jump him and attack. Now I realized as I was studying this passage how passive a person I am. Because whenever I've read this, I always imagined they just grab him and took his coat and just threw him gently into the pit. Just kind of, okay, and he's there. But that is not at all what happened. It was much, much more violent than that. The phrase stripped him is a term used for skinning animals. So, just imagine 9 fully grown men so full of hatred that they're willing to kill him. They've probably already killed him several times in their mind. And now they have a chance to get even. It was vicious, it was brutal, and it was horrible. They took his coat and probably the rest of his clothes with it, and then threw him into a pit that was empty of water. These pits were narrow and deep, so deep he couldn't crawl out of it. So here's Jacob, completely unsuspecting, jumped by his brothers, and now laying in a pit, naked, bruised, bleeding, and alone. Who knows what horrible things they were saying as they were yelling at him as they did this as well. I can only imagine the awful things they said to him. As we continue reading, we see his brothers then sat down to eat. They were so calloused and cold-hearted toward Joseph, that after that horrible incident, they were able to just sit down and eat. We learn later in chapter 41:21, when they're in Egypt, they talk about that they could hear his pleading and begging with them from the pit. So they're sitting here eating, probably laughing and rejoicing at finally putting Joseph in his place. And they can hear him and just ignore his pleading and begging, probably calling their names, saying, Levi, Simeon, somebody help me. And they're just ignoring him, enjoying life because Joseph is now in his place, as they think. So, as we keep reading, in verse 25, it says, as they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, what will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood." His brothers agreed. So when the Midianites merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt. So we see as they're eating, they see a caravan coming their way. And Judah, having learned lots from his uncle Laban, seizes the opportunity and convinces his brothers to sell Joseph and make a profit for him, rather than just leave him there to die. That way, they're rid of him, his blood is not on their hands, and they get something in return as well. So that's exactly what they do. But now what? How do they explain Joseph's disappearance? As we keep reading, it says, "When Reuben returned to the cistern and saw that Joseph was not there, he tore his clothes. He went back to his brothers and said, 'The boy isn't there. Where can I turn now?' Then they got Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, and dipped the robe in the blood. They took the ornamented robe back to their father and said, 'We found this. Examine it to see whether it is your son's robe.' He recognized it and said, 'It is my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces.' Then Jacob tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourned for his son some days. All his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. 'No,' he said, 'in mourning will I go down to the grave to my son.' So his father wept for him." Reuben was gone, most likely checking on some of their sheep. With that many flocks, it made sense that they would take turns going out to check on them and be gone back and forth. And so when Reuben returns to find his plan has been thwarted and Joseph is gone, he flips out. Here we see true anguish and broken-heartedness. He knew how this would kill their father. So the brothers hatch a plan to trick their father into believing Joseph is dead, and then they will be officially rid of him. I wonder if they were thinking, now Dad will love us and care for us. But boy, does that backfire. Instead, we see Dad enter into full-on mourning. The passage points out the steps of realization that Jacob took, almost as if in slow motion. First, he identifies the coat. Then, he realizes Joseph must have been attacked. Then he realizes that must mean Joseph is dead, and he enters full mourning, unable to be comforted, and swears he will mourn until he dies. Instead of gaining Dad's attention and favor, they lose their dads forever to his crippling mourning. The ironic part of the story is that Jacob's betrayal of his father comes full circle. His sons use their brother's clothing and a goat to trick him in the same way he tricked his father. Once again, the sins of the father are being passed down to their sons. Then this chapter ends with a brief description of God's protection of Joseph, where it states that Joseph was sold as a slave to Potiphar, a high official. Joseph could have been sold to anyone, but God saw that he was sold to someone of a high position who would take good care of Joseph and have a good place for him. Is there any thoughts here at the end of this chapter before we continue on? I didn't see anything about that. I don't know. I would think not, since he is younger than Joseph and Joseph himself was at home, but I didn't see anything about it. And she asked if we know if Benjamin was with them. I would think definitely not, but oh, she asked how many brothers wanted him killed. There are very many brothers in this. It would be 9 brothers. Because there's, like 10 of them, I guess. 10, but then Reuben was protecting him. So I don't know. I mean, I guess he kind of wanted him. He probably wanted him gone, but he also didn't, I don't know what Reuben was thinking. But yes, it was 10 brothers, because then it was Joseph and Benjamin. And. So. Any other questions or thoughts? Okay. Well, as we continue reading in Joseph, we come to chapter 38. We take a quick detour from Joseph's life and find out a little bit more about Judah's life. Many people have questioned the placement of this chapter, and even some have questioned why it's in the Bible at all. But what we do know is that the Bible is inspired, and God does not make mistakes. So this chapter is exactly where it is supposed to be. And if you look further into the story, it starts to make sense. First of all, as I said earlier, Judah's line is the one through which Jesus comes. So it makes sense that we need to learn more about Judah. Second, as we read the genealogy of Jesus, we see Tamar and her sons, Perez and Zerah, mentioned. And so without this chapter, we would have no idea why Tamar is listed and why that was significant or why they were a part of the line of Jesus. Lastly, it's important for us to note and understand Judah's worst moment so that we can know how far Judah has fallen in order to see and understand God's redemption of Judah and his ultimate rescue of him. Also, by placing the story here, it gives us a contrast between the next chapter, where we see Joseph's rise in morality and his withstanding temptation, when here we see Judah's backing in morality, falling into temptation. So being here, it kind of gives contrast to the two moments of when Judah falls and Joseph kind of rises. We don't really know exactly when this took place. It could have taken place before Joseph. Like some of it could have been, like he could have left and gone to, at the beginning, to Adullam and kind of gone back and forth. Or it just happened in between. Joseph was gone a really, really long time, so it is possible for it all to have happened between the two chapters. We don't really know exactly, but we do know it happened before he got to Egypt later in the story. So let's begin by learning a little bit about Judah. At that time, Judah left his brothers and went down to stay with a man of Adullam named Hurrah. There Judah met the daughter of a Canaanite man named Shua. He married her and lay with her. She became pregnant and gave birth to a son who was named She conceived again and gave birth to a son and named him Onan. She gave birth to still another son and named him Shelah. It was at Kezib that she gave birth to him. Judah got a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. So here we see that Judah decides to leave home and branch out on his own in Canaan, specifically in Adullam. We also learn that Judah did not listen to his father's warnings about Canaanite women and gave in to his lusts and married a Canaanite woman. We do not even know her name. She's just the Canaanite woman. So Judah had to have known Abraham and Isaac's warnings against marrying Canaanite women, but he chooses not to listen and follows the lusts of his heart instead. This woman is quite fertile and gives him 3 sons, Onan, and Shelah. Now, when the oldest is of marrying age, Judah goes and gets a Canaanite woman for him named Tamar. So now we see that Judah's half-Canaanite son and his Canaanite wife Tamar are set to carry on Judah's family name and line. Sounds like a great plan. So let's keep reading. Verse 7 says, But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the Lord's sight, so the Lord put him to death. Then Judah said to Onan, Lie with your brother's wife, and fulfill your duty to her as a brother-in-law, to produce offspring for your brother. But Onan knew that the offspring would not be his, so whenever he lay with his brother's wife, he spilled his semen on the ground to keep from producing offspring for his brother. What he did was wicked in the Lord's sight, so he put him to death also. Judah then said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, Live as a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up. For he thought, he may die too, just like his brothers. So Tamar went to live in her father's house. So what do we see as we continue reading? Surprise, surprise, Judah's sons are wicked. Not much of a surprise based off of Judah's life choices so far. Judah seems to have followed in his father's footsteps and failed to teach God's faithfulness and promises to his son, and has raised even more wicked sons than his father did, or was so wicked that God kills him. Judah then tells Onan to fulfill his role and marry Tamar to have children with her and carry on his brother's name. This was very customary even among the Israelites. Onan agrees and has no problem marrying her and enjoying the deed, but refuses to actually produce heirs for his brother and wastes his semen on the ground. So, because he too is so very wicked, God kills him as well. This then frightens Judah and fears that his last son will die too if he marries Tamar. He seems naive to his son's wickedness, and he lacks faith in God's promises to their family, and instead decides to trick Tamar into waiting. He tells Tamar to wait at her dad's, and when Shelah is a bit older, he will give him to her as a husband to continue on Er's name. Trusting his word, she agrees. However, we see he never actually intended to give Shelah to Tamar, but he has successfully gotten her out of the way. For if she is betrothed to Shelah, she cannot remarry another, leaving her stuck and in bad shape for her future. This also leaves Judah without an heir, and his line will die off. So let's keep reading. Verse 12. After a long time, Judah's wife, the daughter of Shua, died. When Judah had recovered from his grief, he went up to Timnah to the men who were shearing his sheep, and his friend Hirah the Adullamite went with him. When Tamar was told, "Your father-in-law is on his way to Timnah to shear his sheep," she took off her widow's clothes, covered herself with a veil to disguise herself, and then sat down at the entrance to Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that though Shelah had now grown up, she had not been given to him as his wife. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. Not realizing that she was his daughter-in-law, he went over to her by the roadside and said, "Come now, let me sleep with you." "And what will you give me to sleep with you?" she asked. "I'll send you a young goat from my flock," he said. "Will you give me something as a pledge until you send it?" she asked. He said, "What pledge should I give you?" "Your seal and its cord, and the staff in your hand," she answered. So he gave them to her and slept with her, and she became pregnant by him. After she left, she took off her veil and put on her widow's clothes again. So we see, some time has now passed, and Judah's wife has died. Tamar finds out that he plans to go up to Timnah to check on his sheep. She has realized that Shelah is old enough now for marriage, and Judah has no intention of giving him to her. So she will be stuck a mourning widow forever, and she decides to do something about it. If you notice, she takes off her widow's clothes. She has been stuck forced to mourn and play the widow all this time, whereas Judah mourns his wife a short time and then is ready to get right back at it. Tamar knows Judah's character and knows that he is driven by lusts and will seek to be comforted on his trip. She also knows that prostitutes would be out selling themselves to help ensure the growth of the fields and the herds. So she quickly changes clothes, covers her face, and places herself along his path, waiting for him to come along and take the bait. And what do you know? He falls right into her trap. He sees her, assumes she's a prostitute, and he lusts after her. He approaches her and asks to sleep with her. I find it fascinating and very telling of Judah's character that she didn't even have to call out. It sounds like she didn't even have to invite him. He just sees her and is all too predictably asks to sleep with her. He's so full of lust, he's willing to give her anything in order to have a moment with her. He agrees to pay her a goat, and in the meantime gives her his seal and its cord and his staff. Now the seal is the shape of a cylinder with a seal that's on the bottom to sign important documents, and it hangs on a cord around his neck. And his staff would be just as distinctive to him. So Hugh said it would be as if today he gave her his license and social security number. These declared his individual and corporate identity. There is no way he could deny that these were his things. They were clearly his. It's very interesting to note that once again we see clothes and a goat being involved in the deception of someone in this family. So Tamar has finally conceived and carries this child to carry on the name of But this child is not Judah's grandchild, but his own son, who can now continue on the line of Judah. So let's see what happens. Verse 20. Meanwhile, Judah sent the young goat by his friend the Dulamite in order to get his pledge back from the woman. But he did not find her. He asked the men who lived there, "Where is the shrine prostitute who was beside the road to Enaim?" "There hasn't been any shrine prostitute here," they said. So he went back to Judah and said, "I didn't find her. Besides, the men who live there said there hasn't been any shrine prostitute here." Then Judah said, "Let her keep what she has, or we will become a laughingstock. After all, I did send her this young goat, but you didn't find her." He then continues on his way after this deed, and he follows through with his end of the bargain. He sends the goat back to get his stuff. But shocker, the friend does not find her there. And then he finds out there's not ever been any prostitutes there. So Judah and his friend are shocked, and they decide, let's just leave this alone. They did not want to become a laughingstock or an embarrassment in the area. But can you imagine the concern this still must have left with Judah? I'm sure it's not a small thing to not have your seal and your staff. But he was more concerned with his reputation than finding those things or getting those things back. So, as we continue reading, about 3 months later, Judah was told, "Your daughter-in-law Tamar is guilty of prostitution, and as a result, she is now pregnant." Judah said, "Bring her out and have her burned to death." As she was being brought out, she sent a message to her father-in-law. "I am pregnant by the man who owns these," she said, and she added, "See if you recognize whose seal and cord and staff these are." Judah recognized them and said, "She is more righteous than I, since I wouldn't give her to my son Shelah," and he did not sleep with her again. So we keep reading, we see that 3 months have passed. These must have been some agonizing months for Tamar. She knew the great risk she had taken. She knows the penalty for prostitution and cheating on your betrothed, and she has seen Judah's wicked heart already. There's no guarantee that he would claim this child as his own or own up to it. But finally, the truth comes out. Tamar is pregnant. Judah, showing his true nature, jumps right at the opportunity. At this time, infidelity during a betrothal was viewed the same as adultery, and the penalty was death. So Judah was acting fully within the law, but he seemed all too eager to punish her sins and get her out of his way. Then he doesn't even have to worry about it. He's quick to judge others and slow to see his own sins and his own faults. However, Tamar turns the tables on him and reveals that he is the father. I assume it was out in the open and out for all these people to see. As we read later in the Bible, when they would bring out somebody, it was generally a big scene, a lot of people, loud. So I'm sure there were people everywhere. And she throws this out and says back to him, whose is this? And so there was no chance he could deny it, right? It was very hard. Everyone's around, and these items are very clear. So there wasn't much chance for him to deny it or hide it. Tamar is instantly vindicated, and Judah is instantly humbled. By declaring that Tamar was righteous, he was also declaring that he had acted unrighteously. This is the first hint at change in Judah, as he publicly admits his own moral failure. It seems that this awful fall became a turning point for Judah. We do not know what else happened to him between now and when he goes to Egypt with his brothers. But we do see that God does a work in him, and he is a redeemed and changed man when he gets to Egypt. But let's see what happens to this baby. The end of the chapter 20, verse 27 says, "When the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys in her womb. As she was giving birth, one of them put out his hand. So the midwife took a scarlet thread and tied it on his wrist and said, "This one came out first." But when he drew back his hand, his brother came out. And she said, "So this is how you have broken out." And he was named Perez. Then his brother, who had the scarlet thread on his wrist, came out, and he was then given the name Zerah. So it turns out there's not one, but two babies inside of Tamar, and their birth very much reflects that of Rebekah's with Jacob and Esau. Once again, we see warring brothers and the reversal of the right of the firstborn, just like with Jacob and Esau. God bless poor Tamar. Through her determination to carry on her husband's name and get herself out of a terrible situation, she manages to continue on Judah's name and secures for Judah the honor of fathering the Savior of the world. So once again, God used a Gentile woman to bring about his plan of salvation for his people. Any thoughts on that? Yeah. Yeah, here, hold on. Donna said that she thinks it's strange, or to say it mildly, strange, that God, the conquering seed would come from such terrible circumstances. Yeah, because she says, we think that God's looking for good, and he's choosing those who do good to do his will. Yes, but this story is the exact opposite. Every single person, except maybe Isaac, would be the worst person for him to choose, but yet that is who God chooses, and that's who God continues on and redeems and rescues. Absolutely. Thank you, Donna. Any other thoughts? Yeah. Yeah, so they said, I'm sorry, I don't remember your name. Judy, sorry. Judy said that she wonders when Judah moved away how much guilt he felt, leaving his family behind. If he felt guilty leaving, so he left because he had hatched the plan. She doesn't know if he felt guilt. I don't know. That's a good point. I took it more as thinking that he wanted, with his sinful self, wanted to branch out on his own and have his own land and do his own thing. But that's just as likely that he was feeling guilty. And I mean, his father was miserable. So it was a constant reminder of what they had done. So that could very well be. Any other thoughts? Right. So Lori said it's easier to see that God is working and moving in a situation when he uses messy people, because if he's using good people or seemingly, perfect people, then it could give the illusion it was the people and not God working, which is absolutely true. Yeah, God likes to use us in our weaknesses, for sure. Yes. So Jenny said, how do you do that when you're raising your children and you're teaching them to be good, and then you see all these bad examples? But thankfully, there are lots of good examples that God uses as well. If we think of Joseph, ends up being a really good example of following the Lord. Yes. And ultimately, we're all sinners. And that's what I tell my girls all the time, right? We're all sinners. That's who we are. And thank goodness God helps us to be better and to be good. But it is hard. It is hard when it feels like we're teaching conflicting messages sometimes. That's for sure. Yes. Yeah, Donna says it's comforting. Yes. Donna says it's comforting because she knows herself and she chooses the wrong thing all the time. And so it's nice to see that God is honest about who he chooses and the people that we're working. Exactly. And shows us grace. Absolutely. Yes. Lots and lots of grace and mercy. Very true. Well, that's a lot of what I had to say, but here you can hear it again. So, even when things seemed most dark, God is still sovereign. God is still at work, and God is able to use even the worst in us to bring about his glory. God certainly does not work in the same way we would, but he is always working. Andrew Reed says it so well when he said, "In this way, it is possible to see all of life as a medium of God's activity. He's not just active when we read our Bible and pray. He's also active when we live in our world. Hence, when we wake up tomorrow, we don't wake up to a day without God. Tomorrow is God's day, for he made it, formed it, and works in it. What's more, he wants you to enter tomorrow determined to be his person in it. And let Christ be formed in you as you allow his word to interact with your situation." As we look at these stories, we can see how the choices we make have a great impact on our lives now, but also on our future and our children's lives and futures. So, are you seeking to be who God calls you to be? Are you seeking God in the choices that you make, asking him to lead you and to guide you? So many of these choices probably could have been different if they had just paused and asked the Lord to guide and lead instead of jumping and reacting. Or are you following your own sinful desires, allowing your emotions, your feelings, and your desires to drive you forward, just as they were in these past several chapters? God is working in our world, and God is working in us. He wants to use you and each one of us for his glory. The question is, will you be an active participant in the work he wants to do around you? And this morning, I felt so much like a real Bible study teacher because Donna says all the time how she wakes up and her lesson is changed, and Jenny said it, and I'm always like, what? So this morning, I had more added to my lesson, so I just wanted to point that out. I was very excited that I had an epiphany in the shower. So, yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. I could think for a few moments. I had epiphany. So I wanted to encourage us. You don't have to be perfect or even have it all together to be used by God. Sometimes you do not even have to be willing. But, however, if you come willing, God can do great things in you and through you. They won't always be fun things. If you look at Joseph's life, most of it was not fun. I listened to a sermon by Vodi Bakum. Yes, Vodi Bakum. And he was saying how we like to praise Joseph. We say at the end of his life, look, if you follow God, then you will become rich and powerful. And he says, why are we saying that? Joseph did not even agree with that. Joseph named his sons, God sees me where I'm afflicted. Like he viewed Egypt as affliction. And he viewed being away from the chosen people as affliction. And so God doesn't always make our life fun when we're following him, but he can use us to do great things. So it may not always seem like he's working. I'm sure many times Joseph did not feel like God was working to prepare him, but kept sending him further and further away. But if we offer ourselves to the Lord for his service, he will clean us up, redeem us, and then use us for his glory. No one is too far gone or too awful or done too awful a thing to be redeemed or used by God. Just look at Judah. Not much worse you could do. He was so very wicked and self-centered, and yet God redeems him, transforms his heart, and uses him to bring Jesus into the world. If God can use Judah, He can certainly use each one of us too. And he wants to use you. He wants to transform you into his image. We just need to humble ourselves before him and allow him to work so that we can decrease and he can increase. He will meet you right where you are. You do not need to get cleaned up. God actually prefers that we came to him weak, because when we are weak, then we are humbled, and his glory shines all the more brighter through us. So I encourage you to lay yourself at Jesus' feet and ask him to do a work in you and to use you today for his glory, and we will not regret it. So that is all I have. I'm a little bit early. Tell me, I don't have it with me. Okay. What's the question? That's okay. That's all right. Yeah, Judah's line is the one who he'll come. Tamar's listed. Yep, Tamar's listed in the genealogy. Seeing Judah's flaws helps us to see his redemption and rescue. So Judah's fall with Joseph's rise. Absolutely. No worries. I'm really bad at emphasizing the fill-ins. So, it emphasizes the contrast, Judah's fall with Joseph's rise. You can rise. Yeah. So, because the next chapter is all about when Joseph's tempted, but he resists and makes better choices. So, any other thoughts? All right, well, let's just close in prayer then. And you guys get a few extra minutes today. You're welcome. All right, dear Heavenly Father, I thank you for this day, and I thank you for each of these women who have come here. I thank you for the time we have to study your word, and that we have your word. I thank you that we can be here and be challenged. I thank you for what each of these women brings to the table, for their thoughts and their comments and their participation, Lord. And I just thank you for the way that we can interact together here and study your word. And Lord, I pray for the ladies at home that they're able to interact with us as well, and that they can feel your love and your presence as well, Lord. Bless the rest of our days. Help us to come to you humbled and to seek your will in our lives, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen.